How would you define creative nonfiction?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I suppose there's a rule, and it has to be true. End of story. That you can't make this stuff up. But over the years, since Truman Capote's In Cold Blood 50, 60 years ago, they've been calling this genre, and academics and critics love categories and genres and compartmentalization, postmodern this and that. But his In Cold Blood, he referred to it as faction, combination of fact and fiction. There were no characters in it that were not existent. The events happened, but he imbued it with a narrative sense of a novelist, which was kind of new at the time. And then I made a little list of, well, the key is you can soar, you can be creative, you can use novelistic devices, you can do whatever you want to keep the reader reading or watching the documentary, but you can't make stuff up. You can have a viewpoint or an agenda even, and but you want to be careful not to commit a sin of omission. Tell the other guy's story. Don't leave stuff out. And Greg and I were talking earlier, and I know Ken Burns loves baseball. You can tell from his documentary. And I know Michael Moore does not like big business. You get that feeling pretty clearly. But they both adhere to getting to their point without being disingenuous, without becoming propagandistic, which reminded me last night, I was thinking about this, of Leni Riefenstahl, the German documentary maker who chronicled the Third Reich. Well, beautiful visuals in the Munich stadiums and what have you, but she went off the rails when it came to sins of omission and commission, and so after Truman Capote, Tom Wolfe, about 10 years later, came up with the electric Kool-Aid acid test and the right stuff, which he couldn't have written the right stuff and falsified something. I mean, he would have got sued by the families or the wives of the Mercury 7, and then Hunter S. Thompson took it even further in the 70s and 80s, and what they all have in common is reads like a hell of a tale, but it's true. Versus a textbook that's got truths in it, history textbook, but for my money, I'd rather read David McCulloch on building the Brooklyn Bridge than read a textbook on the date and time and the weight of the bridge and what have you. And it's intrigued me for the last 30 or 40 years. And I wrote feature stories and restaurant critiques down in Palm Beach County, maybe 1,000 bylines. And I really tried every day to, I didn't know what some of the topics were. I mean, my editor would say, go cover this, go cover that. And I tried to imbue the stuff with, characters and emotions and trials and tribulations. And which ironically, after doing 1,000 or more of those, made writing the Churchill book a little easier. I just looked at it as about 1,000 episodes. The Blitz and Rommel and Ike, and would just do an episode a day, and which is what the original author, William Manchester, was a genius at. So I made a little list yesterday and the day before of Tom Wolfe, John McPhee, his essays on everything from rocks to rubber tires. They all read like Stephen King had a hand in it. Peter Mathiasson, Hunter Thompson, Molly Panter Downs from the New Yorker 70 years ago. She spent the war in London and wrote these beautiful pieces on just regular Londoners. So I used her a lot in my book because Churchill and Ike didn't meet regular Londoners. I wanted sort of a chorus of what life was like when the bombs were falling, and Molly Panther Downs did that beautifully, and Edward R. Murrow in his broadcasts. And William Manchester, Anthony Bourdain. If you read Kitchen Confidential 25 years ago, a hell of a story. But it's true. And MFK Fisher, the food writer from 80 years ago, all of these people had visual talents as far as putting stuff on the page that might just as well, you could film Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential and you get a movie. It translates from the page to the film. But one of the reasons I got interested in this, among others, my mentor, William Manchester, wrote 18 bestsellers, nonfiction, a biography of H.L. Mencken, the definitive story on who killed JFK, the death of a president. And he wrote a memoir that was nominated for the Pulitzer in 1978. Bill Manchester. He was a Marine on Okinawa. And he was wounded, he got a Purple Heart, he was hit by a mortar shell, and he served with a bunch of other Marines who, as the years went by, they would go up to Middletown, Connecticut and cheer up Bill. His wife died in 1996. He had 2 strokes. That's when I met him, doing a story on him, because I thought, this is great, I get to do a story on William Manchester. My editor said, yeah, good idea, go. 4 or 5 other Marines who were in their late 70s, 80s at the time, we were having dinner one night, and Goodbye Darkness, Bill's memoir, came up, and one of the Marines said, Bill, I don't know whether to put that goddamn book on my fiction shelf or my nonfiction shelf. And I thought, I had a reporter's notebook. I thought, oh. And he said, Bill, it's just bullshit. We were there. We served with you. You didn't kill the sniper, the first sniper. You didn't kill the second sniper. There were no snipers. And I wrote a story about it when I got back to the Palm Beach Post. And that turned me on to, especially ex-military people call it stolen valor. If you want to make enemies, claim something false about your service, especially if you were never in the service. So Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut committed that sin, and Bill Manchester did. And so I started thinking, well, what else is out there that he shouldn't have called his memoir a memoir. He should have called it a novel. Autofiction, they finally gave it a name about 30 years ago. Or you could write autobiographical fiction, narrated in the third person. But his was a first-person memoir, and it really should have been called a novel. And he didn't win the Pulitzer. I think the Pulitzer Committee dodged a bullet there. They didn't know it, but that would have come down the pike to bite them. So over the years, I just, I think about it. I'm not an academic. I'm not a critic. I was thinking of Dorothy Parker. She's on my list. And again, MFK Fisher and Julia Child to a degree. These are people, and if there's a common ingredient in all of their work, whether it's about World War II or cooking or kitchens in New York City with Anthony Bourdain, it's, you just want to keep turning pages. And the historians like Stephen Ambrose, Band of Brothers, David McCulloch, Antonia Fraser from Great Britain, that pantheon of historians do the same thing in their histories. That's, I don't know, we were talking about something at the bottle, and I mentioned creative nonfiction, and Kurt was, well, what is that?
And then, talk to the other side of the equation, but I want to bounce this, I want you to bounce a question and how it applies to Gregg and documentary filmmaking and the process and your understanding on this topic.
Yeah, I don't even need the question, because I think there's a parallel what's happening in the documentary world. I mean, several years ago, Jamie and I went to see a film at Full Frame, and all of these films had been selected by Joe Berenger, who was their featured director. And this was a true documentary. It was, I can't remember the name, I'm not sure if Jamie does, but it was this, a director had gotten access to a mental ward in some city in Massachusetts. And it was the most gruesome thing you'd ever seen, and it was truly documentary. And this picture that sits in my head now is of the doctor having decided to force feed this patient, I'll call him, with a cigarette. And so he had a tube, he had the bottle that he was going to pour in, ran the tube down the guy's throat, and he had a cigarette ash about that long at the end of his mouth while he was doing all this. It was the most gruesome thing you'd ever seen. It was a story, but certainly not, I think this was probably made in the 60s, 16 millimeter black and white. And today, now we pitched our film to PBS very early on, and the guy who we were talking to said, well, it's got to be 4-act structure, you've got to clearly identify your things, you've got to tell both sides because it's PBS. And that's what people are looking for in the documentary world these days. It has to be entertainment. It's not, yes, you shouldn't lie, you should try to tell both sides, but our film is clearly an advocacy piece. We made that decision consciously, well, partly consciously, because we also couldn't get, ours is a criminal justice story. We'd been recruited by the defense attorney, in this case, to help tell this story. And the prosecution wasn't going to talk to us. I mean, we asked, they said no. So, we didn't do it. So, to the extent that we could keep it fair, we found some footage of them talking that we could use. And tried to tell the story in a more or less even-handed way, but it was definitely an advocacy piece. So, like, who was it? The baseball guy.
Oh, Ken Burns.
Ken Burns, yeah. Like Ken Burns liking baseball, we clearly like the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission.
And the name of that film, by the way, if you want to check, is called In Pursuit of Justice.
And there's a full-page ad in the brochure.
And it was a wonderful film. We were also talking about the documentary on Netflix about Jeffrey Epstein, which I've been really watching a lot of documentaries. I just love them. And I've always considered them to be really something, And one of our judges, Homera Solir, she's in Switzerland, and she's over our human rights and dignity category, and she runs a multinational NGO over there for human trade, sexual abuse, and how countries, hold people accountable. And I said, I wrote a novel about her because she was something else, and I told her, I said, I saw this movie about Jeffrey Epstein. I could not believe it. It was unbelievable. And she said, Kirk, you should know that this was sanitized. What you saw on Netflix was entertaining. This is not really, it doesn't even begin to tell the story of what he did. And so there's another example of embellishing.
Well, and then you look at all of the serialization of stories. I'm going to say Making a Murderer. What was the? Yeah, no, I was the guy in. See, I had too much coffee today, and it's overloading my synapses. The serial that they made about the guy in Minnesota who was exonerated once and then. No, this was, but I mean, anyway, those stories are all put together, and you have to fit the structure, and then some of them are 10 stories long because that's the deal they signed when it really should have been 5, and so that's all fitting it into that. Yeah, I mean, they just.
Yeah, I was curious over the years. I know in feature films, the director, the whole production company has virtually unlimited artistic license, especially you can't libel the dead, so they can do a movie or write a book about anyone real who died and just take them over the coals. But back when Oliver Stone did JFK, I just had an aha moment, and now with the new Marilyn movie, and so many others, but that, and this is almost an aside on society, but if we don't produce in schools or through reading and discussion an articulate and critical audience, people came out of JFK thinking that's what happened, the CIA did it. Or in Maryland, that Jack Kennedy raped her and the Secret Service killed her. I haven't seen the movie Blonde, but I've read scathing reviews. And, the directors could say, it's a movie, it's entertainment, okay. But meanwhile, back in Boston where I grew up, there are kids coming out of 9th grade, 10th grade, barely literate and with no sense of history, no ability to critique society, and what's one of the great mediums, movies and television. And so a lot of people are going to see this movie Blonde and think, oh boy, Kennedy did this, Bobby Kennedy did that, the CIA did this. So again, the onus is on documentary makers, if you will, or nonfiction writers, and really they're just two peas in the same pod of creative storytelling.
The other thing that's happening in the documentary world is that access is key. We were lucky because we talked to our defense attorney in our case, and we ended up having a great big fight that lasted a year, so we couldn't work on the film then, and we couldn't finish it, but access is the key. And I just talked to a guy in Greensboro yesterday, and he's trying to do a piece on spoken word poetry, and he's made an arrangement with a spoken word poet. They thought they were going to do this project, and now the spoken word poet wants to do this project. And as a filmmaker, how do you fight that? If you don't have the access, you can't tell the story. And then if you start going down this path, then the person who has the access is telling you they want to do this. Where's the truth there? That's you got to make all those decisions to be able to tell the story.
It's funny, the new Jeffrey Dahmer movie, I saw a snippet on a couple of news stations that the sister of one of the victims is objecting strenuously to how she was portrayed in this movie. And the directors can say, too bad, it's a feature film, not a documentary. And I watched it, and just by coincidence, being an idler, I watch Forensic Files some days, and they just had done a story on Dahmer, and they had the actual courtroom footage of this sister of a victim just going insane and rushing the defendant's table screaming, and they had to carry her out screaming and kicking. This is 25 years ago. And the scene in the movie is, they might as well have just taken it right from the courtroom film, and she's objecting. And that's her right, 25 years later, she doesn't look too good for what she did back then, maybe. But I'm thinking, you know, if one of my kids, and they're in their 30s, what are they going to believe? I mean, she's going to sue the production company, and it's an exact clip of what she actually did in the courtroom. And so I think to serve, you know, a greater purpose, people who are involved in nonfiction, visually or writing, have a responsibility to really be freaking careful.
Is there any kind of enforcement entity in this?
I would think, you know, critics, if they're honest, the marketplace, you know, otherwise, I mean, if, again, in Stolen Valor, the Congress made it illegal to make money from a stolen military record claim. It's free speech, the Supreme Court ruled, but Congress went back and said, okay, it's free speech, but if you make money from it, you can owe money. And, you know, I think the marketplace will, I know there are some people who saw Michael Moore's films and they just didn't like it. Well, tough. And there are some people who think Ken Burns idolizes baseball. Well, too bad. I mean, it is what it is, and they have their sources and their named sources and people on film, you know, quotes. You can't make that up. And then it's what you do with your viewpoint. You were seeking to exonerate a falsely convicted person. So I can hear the prosecutors saying, damn, this film crew's in town. And, you know, well, that's their problem.
Yeah. There was a film crew in town and like 14 TV stations, so they were pretty out there.
You know, some of the documentaries of today, I've been impressed with some of the films about Adolf Hitler, the Circle of Evil, or the multi-series World War II with colorized footage. What is your feeling? I find these just well done films. I might be naive, but what's your opinion of them?
I remember talking to Mr. Manchester 25 years ago. He didn't watch the History Channel because they were going into alien stuff back then. I occasionally will watch that alien stuff on the History Channel just to remind myself the world can be really nuts. And they have these experts with German accents saying, oh, the pyramids point straight up and only a superior alien culture could have, and the Egyptians didn't have the tools. And I'm thinking, again, who's watching this coming out of the room saying, Mom, Dad, you know, the aliens are here. Some of the History Channel history documentaries I think are well done. The one on World War II they asked me to sit in on it about 6-7 years ago. It's like a 6-part documentary. They came to my house and set up lights and asked good questions and didn't cut and paste, you know, and that was kind of gratifying. But then again, in the world of feature films, a couple of years ago when Darkest Hour came out about Churchill in London, I have yet to see the film. I've seen clips. I got a call from an LA film critic, LA Times, and he said, what do you think? I said, well, I haven't seen it except for some clips. And he said, your preface, they simply filmed your preface. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the bit about Churchill quoting Cicero in the bathtub while drinking champagne, and the bit about this, and the bit about yelling at his secretaries that they can't pronounce anything right or hear right, and on and on and on. And I had written this 65 or so page survey of Churchill so that a reader could read that and get a feel for the guy, his drinking, his humor, the late hours he kept, the newspapers he read. And I said, well, you know, maybe they gave me a credit on the thing. And he said, no. He was trying to provoke me. I said, well, I really don't care. And I didn't, because I used primary sources, and instead of them going through 600 different sources and finding these quotes, why not cherry pick it right from a book? And they could do that if it's a biopic of Ike or Rommel. But there was one scene I finally did see that I thought, here we go again. I don't know if anyone here saw the movie, but there's a scene where Churchill is in the London Underground.
Yes,
And
I remember that.
It's a very diverse
On the
crowd
subway.
in the subway car of West Indian blacks and Indian Sikhs and women and children. And Churchill's writing, and they say, you have to do something, sir. You have to fight. You cannot surrender. And I thought, wait a minute. He only rode the subway once in his life, and he got lost in 1926. And it was the other way around. He was the one who went out during the bombings and inspired Londoners, and they would say, there he is. You go get him, Winnie. Go get him. You know, and he was the one who came up with never surrender, never give in. And I thought, well, that's what you get to do in a feature film, but you don't get to do that in a biography or a history or a documentary.
I thought it was interesting when I first met Paul. There was something on Facebook or on the internet or something about somebody, there was some quote on there, and then there's a picture of Winston Churchill sitting there, and I said, this is a really cool saying, and I showed it to him. He said, he never said that.
Yeah, he's one of the most misquoted people ever, and I have fun idling on Twitter some days. I'll type in Winston Churchill and get all the latest quotes from Churchill, and half of them are more he never said. And it's funny that Yale University Press just came out with their latest edition of Yale's Encyclopedia of Quotations, and there were something like 60 from Churchill in it. And the reviewer in the London Book Review, I was just reading this yesterday, parenthetically said, and apparently he actually said these, because there's so much out there that is false. And every time there's a big historic event, someone on Twitter says, as Orwell said, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And then there's a copy editor I know at Random House who will say, Orwell didn't say that, George Santayana said it. And the Twitter person will say, well, aren't you prickly today? You know, but it's nuts out there.
You know, we've got another 15 minutes, and I wanted to see if any of you guys want to share in this conversation. If any, I know you guys are here for a reason. I really appreciate it. But does anybody have anything that they'd like to ask or? So, anyway, one of the things I'm curious about is who is your favorite example of a bad creative nonfiction writer? And I'm going to ask you the same question with regard to film, and an example of such. Well-known flop as you're concerned.
That's a tough one, and you asked me a week ago, and I've been thinking about it. Still don't have an answer in this. I think the market will deal with that. That if someone wrote a really bad piece of anything 10, 20 years ago, not going to be around much longer, if it's around at all. And aside from propaganda, you know, I mean, propaganda is prima facie bad nonfiction, you know, and that'll stick around.
What do you mean by that, propaganda?
That, the state-sponsored Orwellian, and it doesn't have to be lies. It can be just a distortion of the truth that, depending on your political persuasion, some people don't like one nation under God. That whole genre of stuff, you really got to be discerning and critical and work hard at what are they really saying here. But I can't think of, if maybe someone wrote a memoir about cooking 20 years ago, and I don't know who it is, but it ain't Anthony Bourdain. He's alive and well in history, and it's not MFK Fisher. So the bad stuff, thankfully, goes away.
Yeah, the market kind of flushes it out. I think we were talking about something that becomes a hit, and then finally a couple of years later they realize that there's a lot of BS in it, and it explodes on whoever did it.
In politics, it's ironically, because they all lie, that if you really lie bad, well, you used to be able to get called out on it. Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut served as a Marine during the Vietnam War era. He didn't serve in Vietnam, and he said he did. Well, that's dangerous. Someone's going to call him out. Someone did. But what did it do to his career? Nothing.
Then you have the news person that, remember the guy on the NBC?
Brian Williams.
Brian Williams, and he just a number of little falsifications and stuff. But what's your thought on something that you look at and you go like, wow, this is scoring so well, but give me a break.
I'm going to take a slant on that. I think Ken Burns needs to change his method. I mean, how many slow pans do you need on a piece of artwork with a ponderous voiceover going on? It's just like evolve. Now he has a great PBS audience, and they love him, and they'll pay him lots of money to make these films. But really, although we didn't see the last one. Well, I haven't seen a few of them, but the last one I hear was very different because he rushed it out so that it was topical. The last is the Holocaust, which has just been out the last couple of months, I think. Oh. And he's drawing parallels between Trump and everything that is happening in the MAGA world to what happened in Germany. So maybe that's a little more ballsy than he's been before. Yeah. Yeah, no, I heard an interview with him saying exactly that. He said, we had to rush this. So.
Well, the way I see Ken Burns now, it's almost as if he's gotten, and I have a whole lot of respect for the stuff in the past, but it's almost as if he seems like he's gotten too large and he's got too many people. His name is on the film, but I don't know how much involvement he has in it.
I think he's, at least the producer level. He's in there making decisions, even if he's got people putting the thing together for him. But
yeah.
It's an industry for him.
So one thing I did want to mention, getting back to my interest in some of these documentaries, especially when we're talking about, the politics of the day and how crazy it is and the separation of, the left and right and everything. I have been really getting into these documentaries. And what is your thoughts on these documentaries of the day? Do you think that they really follow the truth, or are they being bent? Should we be, comparing the playbook of Adolf Hitler and all the other people of the past that have, almost destroyed the world to the politics of the day? Is that a fair thing to do, you think?
Yeah, I think we have to be alert, have to scrutinize, criticize, think critically. I remember writing a chapter in my book. I read Mein Kampf cover to cover because I wanted to know what the hell I was talking about, which I had never done in my youth. And then there was a scene, a true scene, in the cabinet meeting in London, and Churchill was trying to warn Stalin in 1940, early 1941, that Hitler's coming. Stalin didn't believe it. He had a security pact with Hitler. Everything was great. And one of his cabinet ministers said something to the effect that, Winston, how do you know this? And he held up Mein Kampf, and he said, it's all here. What he's going to do to everybody. It's right here. And it was. And so his own cabinet had sort of ignored things, especially a few years earlier, Chamberlain and Munich and all that. So it's funny. I saw a forensics file during the pandemic. I used to watch that about this North Carolina writer, and it's not the James Patterson, but I think his name is James Peterson or Patterson, who was convicted for pushing his wife down the stairs in Raleigh. Lived in a big, huge house, rich. And I watched that show, and I thought, whoa, good detective work. And they got him, the son of a gun. And now there's a documentary coming out, or is it a feature film? I think it's a documentary that blows the whole case, or tries to, out of the water.
That story has an intersection with our film because the same bad forensic scientist helped convict this guy, as he did in our case too. So there was the staircase, which was, I think, 7 episodes done by a French company that literally had to fly the footage out of this country because they were afraid something was going to happen to it because it was that explosive at the time. And then when our case happened, the forensic investigator was discredited for all the blood splatter work he'd done, and the French company came back and filmed 4 more episodes of that so that they could tell the rest of the story.
When I first saw the forensics file show a couple of years ago, I thought, man, they did the blood spatter demonstration at the bottom of the stairs using a 2x4 and a tomato or something, and he said, and that means the blood went up, and this is dripping down, and I thought, whoa, you nailed that son of a gun. And now I'm reading that people are disqualified, the evidence was thrown out, and the question remains, of course, for this writer guy, did he do it?
Yeah, and he finally got out for time served, and I think he took like the equivalent of an Alford plea or something.
Right.
Yeah, maybe you could prove me guilty, and there has recently been a fictionalization of that story out.
There's another documentary that came out. This kind of is a slant on this thing in a way, and it's about I think it's called 5 Came Back. It's on Netflix, and it's about back in World War II, some of the top directors and directors went over and covered the war, and they just saw amazing stuff. You know, mental health, what was like when these soldiers came back, and how totally destroyed they were. And one guy filmed that. There was another name you probably remember. It's a great documentary, you know. But these guys would uncover unbelievable. They'd bring back this footage, and it would be buried by the government. So you've got situations where you have this truth, these films, and it's buried. You can't get it out. You know. So what do you think about that?
Like Area 53, I know that the aliens came there, but they won't disclose that. It's a mortal sin. Well, the History Channel says they came. But.
And you know, with your documentary, I mean, really, how much truth can you tell? You know, how politically incorrect can you go? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And even with publishers, book publishers, they want to make sure you're on the straight and narrow. You don't go too far over on this side and that side, which I don't know anything about. You do, but just the rules of publishing.
Well, every year, forever, there's been a book that's been pulled because it was false. That's what happens to really bad false stuff. The publisher pulls it, they burn it. when we were first chatting about this, I remember mentioning that the rule in nonfiction, creative nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, whatever you want to call it, that if you're doing a memoir or a documentary and you've got this scene where your grandmother, you remember your grandmother saying, "I love you," when you were 5, you could be 6, you know, you weren't 16, and this teacher of nonfiction said the rule is, though, your grandmother had to be alive. You know, and that's it. That's the whole genre. That now I know memory is false at times and foggy, and that's the beauty of memory. You know, but if you're a famous person writing your memoir, you know, you got to get things right. And I mentioned to you, Kirk, I forget a woman wrote a memoir about drug use about 30 years ago, prostitution, drugs, bad company, and these charitable organizations made her like a star in the early war on drugs, and then she came clean or got clean, and it never happened. Her whole, and I just saw something about that about a week ago, which reminded me. But the people who used her to stop the drug trade and what have you said it almost doesn't matter, because, you know, the greater evil are the drugs, the fentanyl and what have you. And I thought, okay, that's a point, but you hear that a lot, especially in justice situations. It doesn't matter if his or her story is false. It points to a greater problem that needs a solution. Okay, still, you know, we need critical readers and viewers.
Well, does anybody have any final questions at all?
My question is, living in a world where you're doing something where you're looking to get 1%, 1% of the era where 2.4 ampere valve
I deal with I deal with this in my, I do video production for a living, and my clients are always like,
State that
"Oh."
question so that we can, because I couldn't.
So what I'm hearing you say, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a big difference in the way people perceive media these days, and well, they're two different, I think, two different issues. And one is, I grew up in northern New Hampshire. We had 2 television stations. Had I been old enough, how was I going to get a message out there? The only way was to go, in my case, CBS and ABC. Didn't have a public television station, so that distribution channel is limited to begin with. And it's, right, I mean, for a few years, maybe 10 years ago, those distribution channels expanded immensely with, the internet, and Netflix was competing with Amazon and everybody, so that you had lots of ways you could potentially get your message out. Now, whether people were going to watch it or not is beyond our control. Right now, I think we're in a period where everything's collapsing back down. Netflix won't buy independent documentaries anymore. I know I'm on a chat group called D-Word, which just deals with documentaries, and one of the people there said she pitched her completed documentary to Netflix, and 2 months later they were out there shooting their own version. Because they don't. It's so much cheaper for them to shoot it and own it than it is to pay somebody off.
I think you told me that.
Probably I did, because it really bugs me. So there's that of how we're getting our message out. We've got our film now because we found a distributor, or actually they found us, and it's on Amazon and it's on Tubi, and we get 50 cents every time somebody watches it or something. And the guy that I was talking to said most people watch it on Tubi because on Amazon it costs $1.99, and on Tubi they have to watch a couple of commercials. And we're still getting $40 a month, or a quarter. We're not getting any, so nobody's watching it. How do we publicize it? The other issue I think you're also talking about is what are the kids who want to watch 30 seconds or less to figure out whether they're interested in something, and how do you attract their attention? And I tell this to my clients all the time, is they'll watch it if they're interested. So when they're browsing through all these videos, they have to be short so they can watch them. But, they watch television shows, they watch movies, they watch all this stuff. So if they're interested in it, they're going to watch it. And you can't force people to be interested in it unless you tell a good story. So I think they're still approachable. But it's got to be something that they're watching. You're not going to help them by having a lot of fast cuts, or, that's not going to matter. It still has to be good storytelling. But then again, I'm 66 years old, and it's like,
You're my age. Well, one thing I want to
Kirk.
do is, we're going to bring it to a close. We're a little over. But I want to thank Gregg and Paul for being here. Please take an opportunity to get to know these guys, Google them, their work. It's phenomenal. And I'll tell you, I Google Paul Reid, not R-E-E-D, R-E-I-D. Just do yourself a favor, and you'll see these interviews of him on C-SPAN talking about history, Churchill. They're just wonderful. And then you were doing an interview with Boris. Tell me a little bit about that. That was funny.
Well, whatever you think of Boris Johnson's politics, he's a hell of a guy to spend a night with in New York City. And a friend of mine owns a bookstore in New York City, Chartwell Books, nothing but Churchill books. And he put together a forum like this at the Yale Club about 5-6 years ago with Boris, who had just come out with his Churchill book, and me. And yeah. And it was a riot. I think both of us, being clowns at heart, were trying to out-clown the other guy, but it was fun. And then we went across the street to Grand Central to the Oyster Bar, and a lot of fun. He's a smart guy, really smart. And, again, his politics aside, but in that business of his, they're slippery like eels. And one thing to your question and what you guys were just discussing, it reminded me of a collateral thing that's going on now, that not as much as it used to 20, 30 years ago, what historians and nonfiction writers call presentism, and Mr. Manchester used to call generational chauvinism. And it's happening to Churchill, to Lincoln, to George Washington, and that is the trap, I think it is, the pitfall of judging people who lived 150, 200 years ago by our standards. And you got to be real careful there. I mean, no doubt Winston Churchill was a racist in modern parlance. He called blacks blackamoors. I mean, appalling ignorance. And then you dig deep into Abe Lincoln, same thing. And it's something in any nonfiction endeavor to be wary of, to impose our values on someone who's been dead for 50, 100, 300 years. And I'm always on alert for that in documentaries or any nonfiction work, and just something else to keep in mind.
So anyway,
Gregg asked me that too. Oh, someone else did. I started about 8 years ago now at my ambitious social history of the 1850s in this country. All the bad presidents, Van Buren and Fillmore and Pierce and Buchanan and Senator Douglas, the little giant from Illinois who was as corrupt as anybody alive now. And I didn't want to write a history. I wanted a social history, and I had fun, and I did quite maybe 100, 200 pages. What intrigued me was nobody saw what was coming as far as the Civil War. Nobody, not one person. Greenleaf Whittier was yelling and screaming, and so was Clay and Calhoun, but nobody saw what was 8, 6, 4, 2 years away. And then I started poking around, and railroads were being built all over the place, more in the north than the south, which is partly why the North won. And the laws of thermodynamics weren't even configured yet. That came about 20 years later. They were building these trains that weighed 50 tons and could go 80 miles an hour without understanding entropy, steam, metallurgy wasn't even a term, tensile strength, when does an alloy fail? And the reward they reaped for that was steamboats blowing up all over the waterways, trains blowing up. It was just crazy, and it made me realize that history is contingency. It might happen, it might not. Whether you get home alive in your car on a snowy night is contingency. And I found it intriguing, and Dickens, Charles, visited here during those years, and he said sleeping on a steamboat in the Mississippi was like going to sleep on the roof of a gunpowder factory. I mean, you're just waiting for it to blow up, and they did, and the rails broke, and I don't know how we got from 1850 to 1880, if you will, to the electric light and et cetera. And that was my big project, and then I just got lazy.
So the ETA on that is when hell freezes over? Or
What's that?
The ETA on that delivery of that next book is when?
Oh, they'll have to find someone 20 years old, 50 years from now to finish it.
And thank you very much for coming. We hope that you stick around for the festival. And thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
guys
very
so
much.
much.
Thank you, Kirk.